It's one of the biggest chapters in all of history. But what do you really know about World War II? If you're just going off what you learned in history class, you probably don't know all this.
Hitler's goal of a German master race controlling the world required space and plenty of Aryan DNA. Little wonder that he set his sights on the US. But how detailed were his plans, and were they already underway? History is very clear about Hitler's relentless march across Europe and his desire to rebuild under the flag of the Third Reich. But what about across the Atlantic? James P. Duffy, historian and author of Target America, Hitler's Plan to Attack the United States, says that's a little less clear, and historians have long debated how much Hitler wanted. Duffy says that Hitler intended to rule the world. He cites a 1927 letter from Rudolf Hess to the London-based Nazi Walter Hevel, in which Hess wrote of Hitler preaching, "World peace will be realizable only when one power, the racially best power, has attained complete and uncontested supremacy. That power can then provide a sort of world police." This seems to confirm there were plans for even America to fall under the jurisdiction of a global Nazi law enforcement agency. Hitler definitely had his eye on the US. Although the national interest calls the Nazi attempt to build a bomber that could cross the Atlantic an idiotic waste of resources, the idea behind building something literally called the America Bomber means that the US was on Hitler's list. And that, says Duffy, was just part of it. In 1941, the Nazi regime started planning for a post-war world. First and foremost, that meant a massive navy with hundreds of submarines, anchored by 25 battleships and 150 destroyers. In the spring of 1941, Life magazine sent correspondent and former Belgian ambassador John Cudahy to report on what was happening in Germany. Cudahy got a sit-down with Adolf Hitler himself, who started by pointing out that convoys, just like the ones that the US was sending to Britain, signified war. So Cudahy got right to the point and asked Hitler what his plans were regarding the US. He explained that most Americans backed the idea of going to war against Nazi Germany because they were afraid that once Europe fell, they'd be next. Speaking through a translator, Hitler called the idea preposterous. Cudahy wrote, "He laughed at that and refused to take me seriously. He said the idea of a Western Hemisphere invasion was about as fantastic as an invasion of the moon." According to Cudahy, Hitler went on to say that he had too high an opinion of the intelligence and good sense of Americans. The logistics didn't work. Millions of troops would need to be moved across the Atlantic for the Nazis to gain a foothold in the US. That meant there was absolutely nothing for America to worry about. At least Hitler said so, but rational thought and reasoning weren't his strongest qualities. In order to talk about what Hitler might have had in store for the US, it's worth mentioning just why he might want to see that part of the world burn, at least eventually. According to University of North Carolina Emeritus Professor of History Gerhard L. Weinberg, Hitler had been writing about taking out the US as far back as the 1920s. While he wanted global domination for Germany and all that, he also felt like it was sort of his moral obligation to right a perceived wrong, and that skewed his view in favor of war with the US. It all went back to the stab-in-the-back myth, which the US Holocaust Memorial Museum describes as the belief that Germans' loss in World War I came not on the battlefield, but because of espionage, sabotage, and subterfuge on the home front. All that was, of course, supposedly led by those who would become enemies of the Nazi state, including Jews, liberals, and communists. At the same time, it meant that America didn't really have all that much to do with Germany's loss. Therefore, America wasn't a military might that needed to be contended with. But what historian and author James P. Duffy says was described as Europe's greatest future rival. That meant Hitler believed he could wrap up the war in Europe, take his sweet time building up a navy, then deal with the US. Adolf Hitler famously wrote Mein Kampf, but less famously, he wrote a second book, the very directly named Hitler's Zweites Buch, or Hitler's Second Book. According to Target America, Hitler's Plan to Attack the United States, the book was written in 1928 but not published until 1961. It outlined a series of 3 conflicts, and it wasn't until the third one that Hitler got around to the USA. First, Hitler saw his Germany taking on France to regain what they'd lost post-World War I. Then, he was going to head east and seize all the land and agricultural resources he needed from the Soviet Union. And then, on to America, which he wrote was a real threat to German domination of the world. But here's the thing. Hitler wrote that analysis before the Great Depression got into full swing. As he watched what was unfolding across the Atlantic, he eventually came to the conclusion that America was so weakened by her own problems that it didn't really matter. The Third War could wait. According to Gerhard L. Weinberg, Hitler believed that wrapping up the war in Europe, stabilizing his Third Reich, and building up an army of long-range forces was all something he could take his time doing. America, he thought, was too weak to do anything but wait. There's a lot that's been written about Adolf Hitler's obsession with taking on the Soviet Union, but according to Cambridge historian Brendan Sims, he was just as obsessed with the US. So much so, Sims told ex-Berliner, that it shaped policies across the Third Reich. Sims explains that the more research he did, the more he found about Hitler's focus on America. It became absolutely obvious that Anglo-America, that's my phrase, Hitler tended to refer to them as the Anglo-Saxons, was the biggest kid on the block, his main focus, his main enemy, the partner he would have liked, the biggest element of his reality. That's a massive claim, and Sims says that there were a few layers to Hitler casting his greedy eye toward the US. Part of it started with the US having something that Germany didn't: size. Let's put that in perspective. The US is about 28 times the size of Germany, but that only tells part of the story. Germany could fit inside California and take up about only 85% of the state. It's also about the same size as Montana and New Mexico, give or take a bit. Even if Hitler had managed to take over all of Europe, building his master race would require a ton of space and a ton of resources, which America has in abundance. Adolf Hitler was front and center at World War I's Second Battle of the Marne, and according to Cambridge historian Brendan Sims, it was there that he had a run-in with two American soldiers who made a massive impression. They were tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. Sound familiar? Hitler's attempts to build his master Aryan race are well documented, and Sims says there's another, often overlooked part of that. Hitler developed a theory that one of the richest places to find all that Aryan DNA he was so obsessed with was the USA. Conquering America meant all new seeds from which his Aryan race could grow. The theory went like this. Over the course of hundreds of years, the US population had been reinforced by immigrants from Europe.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
They weren't just any immigrants either. They were the brightest, the strongest, the most adventurous, and the most resilient. They left behind a Europe that was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and famished. They headed west and settled in the US. There, they thrived with wide open spaces and resources of the type only America could offer. And United States laws helped reinforce his ideas about just how pure their blood was. Legislation limited or outlawed immigration from certain areas of Europe, like the Slavic countries, along with interracial marriages. In other words, he saw the US as an invaluable source of genetic material. Henry Ford is often lauded as the father of the American automobile industry. But here's the thing. While he was a genius when it came to industry and manufacturing, he was a terrible person. Ford was a raging anti-Semite.
Ford blamed the Jewish people for everything from World War to short skirts, cheap movies, and jazz music.
And PBS says that he was often quoted saying that all the world's ills could be traced back to Jews or to the Jewish capitalists. And if that's the sort of thing that seems like it would have Hitler singing "You've Got a Friend in Me," it absolutely was. According to Bradley W. Hart, author of Hitler's American Friends, it was even more than that. Ford was spouting anti-Semitic rhetoric long before mainstream America knew about things like the concentration camps, and his views didn't go unnoticed by Hitler. According to research from The Nation, Ford profited heavily from manufacturing for the Third Reich, even for months after the US officially declared war. A contemporary report from the US Treasury Department shows they knew about it, summed up in this observation. There would seem to be at least a tacit acceptance by Ford's son, Mr. Edsel Ford of the Reliance, on the known neutrality of the Ford family as a basis of receipt of favors from the German Reich.
In July 1938, Ford accepted Germany's Grand Cross, the highest honor the Third Reich could bestow on a foreigner.
Hart goes on to say that Hitler saw Ford as a way into America, and he uncovered records describing how Hitler had tapped Heinrich Ford to become what Hitler described as the leader of the growing fascist movement in America. World War II usually plays out as an Allies versus Axis conflict, but it wasn't that neat and tidy. According to the National World War II Museum, the US had a faction of Nazis that weren't just alive and well, they were holding rallies at venues like Madison Square Garden. The German-American Bund dated back to 1936, and the entire idea behind the organization was to promote all the ideals and racial hatred that went along with being a Nazi. That Madison Square Garden event attracted about 22,000 loyal members in 1939, and it was done under the command of a German World War I veteran named Fritz Kuhn. The Bund, of course, got the attention of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And while they were found not to be a threat to national security, there is an interesting footnote. One of the claims used to discredit the Bund was that Kuhn reported directly to Hitler and that Hitler was meddling in US affairs. It makes sense that Hitler would be thrilled to have a Nazi party ready and waiting for him. But not only was that not true, but according to traces, Hitler outright denounced the party. Why? Because the Nazis thought the Bund was giving them a bad name. Names like Dachau and Auschwitz are instantly recognizable, but they made up only a sliver of a percentage of the facilities the Nazi regime built to contain, enslave, and execute those they didn't like. Here's a terrifying statistic. According to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, there were more than 44,000 camps of varying purposes, all detention and incarceration based, that were active during the Third Reich. Would those camps have been set up in North America? According to the CBC, probably. In 2019, the Library and Archives Canada purchased a book that had been taken from Hitler's personal library. It was called what translates to Statistics, Press, and Organizations of Jewry in the United States and Canada. The 137-page book is essentially a compilation of data on Jewish populations across North America.
What this book shows us is that there was already the beginnings of a plan, had the war gone differently, that the Holocaust would have happened here.
And as the LAC curator Michael Kent explained, this information would have been the building blocks to rolling out the final solution in Canada. The book, written by Nazi linguist Heinz Kloss, details things from ethnicity and languages of cities' populations to listing Jewish organizations. And Kent further explained to The Guardian that the book is essentially proof that Hitler and the Nazi Party had plans to expand the Holocaust to North America. Kent said, "The Holocaust wasn't a European event. It was an event that didn't have the opportunity to spread out of Europe."
Dropping the atomic bomb signaled an end to World War II. But what if it hadn't? It's a question the Allies pondered, and they had some answers. Looking back, it may seem like the end of World War II was a foregone conclusion. After all, by August 1945, the Axis powers in Europe had been defeated, so surely Japan would soon surrender as well. But that wasn't exactly the case. For one thing, the Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March of that year made Japan's resolve to keep fighting painfully clear. Some believe the only way to end the war once and for all was with nuclear weapons, and so the United States dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, followed by another one over Nagasaki 3 days later. Then on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito publicly surrendered. But history could have been very different if more hawkish voices had prevailed. In the face of continued Japanese resistance, the obvious solution to some decision-makers was to fire even more nuclear weapons. But not everyone seemed to think it was a good idea, including, thankfully, President Harry Truman. General George C. Marshall was also skeptical about more nuclear strikes. He argued that if Japanese officials wouldn't surrender after the first two bombings, then even more bombings were unlikely to convince them otherwise. He did, however, inquire about the use of nuclear weapons to support a ground invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. There was plenty of wariness about carrying out another nuclear attack, but there was also some doubt about whether or not the first two would be enough to get Japan to surrender. During a telephone conversation on August 13, 1945, General John E. Hall and Colonel Lyle E. Seaman discussed the possibility of the Manhattan Project producing a third nuclear weapon. Seaman told Hull that it would take about 10 days until a new bomb would be ready for deployment. He also mentioned that the Manhattan Project could probably average 3 new nuclear weapons per month if they were given enough warning ahead of time. Nuclear weapons weren't just designed at the Manhattan Project's facility at Los Alamos, New Mexico. They were also assembled there. On a broader scale, booming American war production supported the development and transport of these potential weapons. After all, the majority of Allied equipment was American-made, including hundreds of thousands of planes, 2 million trucks, and 17 aircraft carriers. As for President Truman, he was reportedly haunted by the many Japanese deaths after the first two bombings, though he nevertheless had to at least consider ordering another nuclear strike. As British diplomat John Balfour wrote to his nation's Foreign Office on August 14, 1945, the president remarked sadly that he now had no alternative but to order an atomic bomb to be dropped on Tokyo. The next day, however, Emperor Hirohito announced his nation's surrender. Clearly, the destruction wrought by nuclear weapons was enough to make President Truman and many military officials question what they were doing. They could have just resorted to the established precedents of warfare and used other types of bombs. Just because other weapons weren't equipped with nuclear firepower didn't mean that they weren't also incredibly destructive.
The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold.
By some metrics, conventional bombs were even more damaging. The earlier U.S. firebombing campaign that targeted Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Japanese people. Another million were left homeless after the resulting firestorm. Further firebombing attacks throughout the country claimed thousands more lives. Truman acknowledged this terror as well as the continued strength of Japanese opposition in its aftermath when he said, "The firebombing of Tokyo was one of the most terrible things that ever happened, and they didn't surrender after that, although Tokyo was almost completely destroyed." The United States wasn't the only member of the Allied forces moving against Japan in 1945. With the fall of Europe's Axis powers, the Soviet Union began to turn its efforts toward the war's Pacific theater. At the February 1945 Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union agreed to join the fight against Japan soon after Germany's surrender. American General Douglas MacArthur expected the Soviets to engage with Japanese forces in the occupied Chinese territory of Manchuria. Soon afterwards, the Americans would commence an invasion of the Japanese home islands. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union did just that by declaring war on Japan and almost simultaneously beginning their attack on Manchuria. By this point, FDR had died and Harry Truman had taken his place. Truman met with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in July and August at the Potsdam Conference. Stalin learned that the U.S. had a new and powerful weapon on its hands, though Truman didn't necessarily specify that the U.S. had nuclear capabilities. It did surely make Truman's Potsdam threat to prompt and utter destruction against Japan sound far more serious than just some performative chest thumping, though. To many Allied strategists, a land invasion of Japan was practically inevitable, but the prospect of sending thousands of troops into the country wasn't exactly a pleasant idea. The U.S. had overtaken smaller territories, but with great effort and many casualties. An estimated 13,000 American service members were killed in the struggle for Okinawa, about 35% of the forces sent to that small outlying island.
We had crossed the island, and that was when our trouble began.
That bloody toll was certainly on the minds of Truman and others. They believed that a land invasion of Japan's home islands would produce at least as many casualties at Okinawa, if not more. Those projections didn't include Japanese deaths, although the assumption was that those numbers would be staggering as well. At one point, Truman wrote, "My object is to save as many American lives as possible, but I also have a human feeling for the women and children of Japan." Despite these concerns, plans for a ground invasion known as Operation Downfall were put into motion. Conceived in early 1945, the operation was intended to target the islands of Kyushu and Honshu and slated to begin in December that year. The use of poison in various forms was also considered during the plans to invade Japan. One possibility was an herbicide applied to rice crops, although this wouldn't have been feasible until after the start of the land invasion. Plus, the rice may have been needed to feed Allied troops. Moreover, millions of Japanese civilians could have died, especially considering that the country was deeply food insecure by 1945. But this strategy could have been reconsidered if the invasion went on for an extended period. General George C. Marshall also pushed for the use of poison gas, though he told President Truman that it would be only used against combatants who wouldn't surrender. Marshall argued that gassing soldiers would spare the lives of American personnel, as opposed to having them confront Japanese forces face to face, which happened at Iwo Jima. But Truman refused to give the go-ahead. His argument was based on a precedent established by his predecessor. FDR had said that he would only allow it if the enemy deployed its own poison gas attacks first. Now, there's no indication that this option was ever completely off the table, though. If a land invasion proved difficult or the mounting number of casualties began to weigh heavily on commanders, then Truman could very well have been persuaded that gas attacks were a necessary evil.
The gas burnt my throat, caused pains in my chest, and made breathing all but impossible.
The United States hardly planned to conduct a land invasion alone. By July 1945, the British Chiefs of Staff outlined campaigns of their own that were meant to retake parts of Southeast Asia and Singapore. But some officials worried that these plans weren't enough. If there wasn't a significant British presence in Operation Downfall, would the American attitude toward one of its allies sour? And how would Asian nations feel about Britain returning after the war and attempting to manage territories after having done so little to repel the invading Japanese forces? So even though Douglas MacArthur was set to oversee Operation Downfall and the whole operation was to be completed with American oversight, it was also agreed that Great Britain would contribute. And so British troops were set to take over for some of the American divisions that were supposed to invade Honshu. There were also plans for other soldiers from parts of the Commonwealth to join in the land invasion, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. British divisions would have been able to keep their own uniforms, but for simplicity's sake, they would have all been given American weapons and other supplies before the invasion began. Now, by the summer of 1945, the American Navy had already established a blockade of Japan. If Japan refused to surrender, then this strategy would have intensified. Alas, this could have led to the deaths of millions of people by cutting off supplies to a nation that had long depended on imports. Japan had already been experiencing these difficulties for years, as President Roosevelt had shut down exports of steel and oil after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. Goods from Japanese territories in the Pacific were similarly cut off, largely by mines and submarines patrolling nearby waters. As the war went on, this blockade became more aggressive. The American military produced more weapons, crafts, and soldiers. By 1945, Japan's imports had slowed to a mere trickle. American strategists didn't necessarily know that Japan's agricultural sector was already in dire straits. Rice crops performed poorly in 1945, so a blockade that halted food imports could have been profoundly deadly. Plans to attack the country's rail system would have exacerbated this problem. Strikes on the rail infrastructure, which was already limited, would have made it even more difficult to move rice around the country to hungry citizens. Furthermore, shipping goods during the war from one region of Japan to another along the coasts was also all but impossible due to the blockade.
Japan was basically in ruins at this point.
Considering the resistance that Allied forces encountered in Japanese-held territories like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, commanders expected opposition on the main islands of Japan to be at least as fierce, if not more so. They got ready for the seemingly very real possibility of a long and arduous occupation. General MacArthur, who was the Allied commander of Japan from 1945 to 1951, was among those who predicted that an occupation after a land invasion would be a grinding slog. Specifically, he expected a decade or more of attempting to control Japan, which would be all the more difficult by the possible presence of guerrilla fighters. It was widely assumed at the time that the Japanese people thought they were winning, or at least believed that they could still prevail in the face of Allied encroachment. But there's evidence that higher-ups in the Japanese military were less optimistic. While the Allies were planning Operation Downfall, Japanese officials made the reasonable assumption that an invasion was in the works and that it would eventually make its way to Tokyo. In response, some of them planned suicide attacks or similar initiatives. There were others, though, including Emperor Hirohito and his advisors, who pushed for a much less bloody diplomatic solution, even if it meant finally admitting defeat. Auschwitz. There are few places on Earth that conjure up more images of death, horror, and pure agony than the Nazis' most infamous concentration camp. Here's what no one ever told you about it. A Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki walked into a crowd of people in Warsaw. They were being rounded up by German officers in preparation to be sent to Auschwitz, and he went voluntarily as part of the resistance. He smuggled out a series of reports on what was really going on inside the camp. Documents made their way to the outside world in 1940, 1941, and 1942, and after his escape in 1943, he wrote more. The result is an eyewitness account of the horrors, starting with the public execution of some of the camp's Polish prisoners, who were sometimes shot and sometimes left to the elements. Later, Pilecki saw the focus shift to Jewish prisoners, writing, "Over 1,000 a day from the new transports were gassed. Corpses were burnt in the new crematoria." While fighting typhus and surviving beatings, Pilecki organized a resistance network within the camp, in addition to sending messages. The first message read, "Bomb Auschwitz." Pilecki escaped in 1943 and lived to see the end of the war and the liberation of the camp, but his commitment to the idea of a free and independent Poland was seen as problematic. In 1947, he was arrested by the communist leadership, tortured, and declared an enemy of the state. He was executed the following year. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, around 23,000 Roma were sent to Auschwitz, and 21,000 died there, but they were also part of an insanely brave rebellion. Most Roma were held in a section of Auschwitz called Zigeunerlager, a sort of holding center for entire families. It was established in 1942, and in 1944 it was decided that everyone in the camp was going to be executed, for the simple reason that the space was needed for more prisoners. At the time, there were around 6,000 Roma there. One day, after they were warned that their executions were imminent, around 600 armed themselves with hammers and shovels, barricaded themselves in their barracks, and told the Nazis that if they wanted to take them to the gas chambers, they'd better come in and get them. The date was May 16, 1944, and here's the incredible thing. According to the Council of Europe, they sort of won, at least temporarily. No one died that day, as had been planned. Instead, half the Roma prisoners were transferred to other camps. For the remaining half, the respite was merely a stay of execution. They were sent to the gas chambers a few months later. May 16th is now remembered as Romani Resistance Day for their attempts to stop the Nazis. The Sonderkommando were selected from amongst the healthiest men who were sent to Auschwitz. Some were promised their own survival, while others were told they could protect their families by working for the Nazis. They discovered very quickly that neither promise would be kept. The Sonderkommando were selected because of their strength. Part of their job was to lie to prisoners so they would stay calm while they escorted them to gas chambers. Afterwards, they removed the bodies. They would sort through clothes, collect valuables, extract any gold teeth, and carry the dead to the crematorium. Then, when the ashes began to pile up, they shoveled it into a nearby river. Every few months, a Sonderkommando would be executed and new prisoners took their place. By the time this had happened a few times, people knew what they were in for, so the 12th Sonderkommando decided to take some Nazis with them. Prisoners Rosa Rabata and sisters Esther and Hanka Weitzblum worked at a munitions factory where they, along with some co-conspirators, started smuggling gunpowder to the Sonderkommando.
They used this gunpowder and manufactured little hand grenades.
On October 7, 1944, Polish prisoners in Crematorium 1 grabbed a particularly sadistic guard and stuffed him in an oven. The workers at the other 3 crematoriums soon joined in. The gunpowder was taken to Crematorium 4. There, in a suicide mission, the Sonderkommando detonated the ovens. The crematorium would never be used again. When the Nazis regained control of the situation, 200 Sonderkommando were immediately executed. Their bodies were disposed of by the 13th Sonderkommando. The women involved were discovered and tortured, but never gave up the names of living conspirators. They were hanged on January 5, 1945.
But they were instrumental in saving tens of thousands of Jews who would have been gassed and burned in Crematorium number 4.
Whenever new prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele was on the train platform waiting and watching. Among the things he was looking for were identical twins.
He demanded to know from my mother if we were twins. And my mother didn't know what to say. She asked if that was good.
Records indicate that Mengele experimented on 732 pairs of twins at Auschwitz, although some estimates place the number at around 1,500. Some of his subjects survived, and many later gave testimony about what was done to them, and it's pretty horrible. Some twins remembered being given injections that were supposed to change a person's eye color, while others were deliberately infected with a variety of diseases and substances. Twins would be measured and documented. Their reactions, sometimes to things like surgery without anesthetic and forced sterilization, would be recorded. Often, one twin would be used as a control subject while the other was experimented on. When that twin died, the other was killed and they were both autopsied, all with one goal in mind: to find new ways to advance the development of Hitler's master race.
You'll make twins with German women?
That's the goal.
Even though the only doctor you may have heard of was Joseph Mengele, he wasn't the only one performing medical experiments at Auschwitz. Karl Klauberg was working alongside Mengele in the area known as Block 10, and he was interested in finding an efficient way to sterilize large groups of people.
Block 10's main purpose was a secondary genocide, or in other words, killing the unborn.
Among his methods was a non-surgical procedure that introduced chemical irritants into the female reproductive organs. The inflammation it triggered caused swelling and sterility, and also caused quite a bit of death. Dr. Horst Schumann was working on the same project, only his methods involved exposing patients to X-rays in order to try and find just the right amount of radiation to sterilize without burning. This technique was deemed unsatisfactory as there were too many casualties. Dr. Johann Paul Kramer was starving prisoners to see what happened as people wasted away, and Dr. August Hirt took the opportunity to collect Jewish skeletons in the hopes of taking measurements that would confirm Jewish individuals were biologically different and therefore inferior to Aryans. Block 11 was a punishment block reserved for prisoners suspected of things like sabotage. Prisoners caught trying to escape were condemned to death by starvation and sent here to die in the aptly named dark cells. There were also so-called standing cells with floor space of less than a square meter where air entered through a single 5-centimeter square vent. As many as 4 prisoners at a time would be locked in that small space. Some were sent there for weeks at a time, usually just at night though, as they were required to work during the day. Block 11 was right next to Block 10, and they made up another infamous portion of Auschwitz, a place known as the Death Wall. Flogging was done in the courtyard. Prisoners were executed against the wall. Freddie Hirsch could have escaped. His mother, brother, and stepfather headed to Bolivia after Hitler's rise to power. He stayed behind in Germany and then ended up in Czechoslovakia, and it was there that he began his life's work, saving children. Hirsch was charming, and he used his personality to keep the Nazi guards at bay and keep his focus on the children. At first, he worked with the children in Jewish ghettos. He made sure that they had personal hygiene items and that they continued their education and got daily exercise. In 1943, he was caught facilitating communication between Jewish children and Terezin in the outside world. He was sent to Auschwitz. Once there, he established the children's blocks, where kids would spend their days before returning to their parents in the barracks at night. In secret, he oversaw their continuing education and arranged for life-saving measures. Because of Hirsch, roll call was done indoors instead of outside in the rain and snow, and he secured a steady supply of extra food. Packages that came into the camp addressed to people who were already dead were redirected to the children. By the beginning of 1944, he was caring for hundreds. This also coincided with his 6th-month anniversary at Auschwitz. Prisoners chosen for special treatment would be eliminated after 6 months. Hirsch had a few choices: join Auschwitz's underground resistance, lead a revolt, or try and escape. They gave him an hour to decide. When the hour was up, his body was discovered. No one is sure what happened to him. He either took his own life or a Jewish doctor facilitated his passing. Before his death, he appointed 2 successors to make sure his work protecting the children of Auschwitz continued. It's well known that concentration camp prisoners who were healthy enough to work were forced to do so, but it wasn't until fairly recently that another part of the Nazis' forced labor scheme came to light: Heinrich Himmler's reward plan. According to the Ravensbrück Center, Himmler decided female prisoners could be turned into sex workers. There were a few things likely at play here. For one, Himmler believed he could prevent homosexuality by making women available. And secondly, according to Reuters, he thought prisoners would work harder if they were promised a trip to the brothel at the end of the day. At the Auschwitz brothel, 21 women worked at the same time. Some, it was believed, volunteered, while others were escorted there only to realize where they were when their first client was shown in. The women who have spoken about their time working in a Nazi brothel described how they were forced to see as many as 10 men in a span of 2 hours. Some of the men, they said, just wanted to talk to a friendly person. On January 27, 1945, the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front became the first Allied troops to enter Auschwitz, and the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum says that around 7,000 prisoners were waiting for them.
First thing we noticed is the turret was not aimed at us.
They were free, but thousands of others were still in hell. The Nazis knew the Soviet army was coming, so they tried to move around 56,000 prisoners deeper into German territory, where they could still use them as forced laborers. We know it happened, but according to the New York Times, there was so much chaos and confusion that this is one of the least documented aspects of the Holocaust. We do know that only those thought strong enough to survive were taken. Still, it's estimated that around 15,000 people died during the death marches from Auschwitz alone. Some were shot as they passed through villages. After the death march had passed, the dead were collected and given a proper burial. Memorials mark the places where groups were executed, but for many others, nothing remains. When Witold Pilecki escaped and told the outside world what horrors were happening at Auschwitz, he begged the Allies to bomb the camp to put an end to the Nazi genocide. But Auschwitz was never bombed. Why? It's complicated. According to The Guardian, Pilecki wasn't alone. Representatives of the Jewish community also petitioned the U.S. War Department asking them to bomb the camp, but the U.S. declined. They claimed it would require precision bombing that was beyond their capabilities, and that the camp was well beyond the reach of their bombers. They said their air forces were needed elsewhere and that the mission posed too much of a danger to American troops.
Isn't this a thing for our Soviet allies anyway? Being much closer to the intended target than us, I mean.
According to the Jewish Virtual Library, however, there was another reason: the inevitability of civilian casualties. The question came up again and again, and in 1944 the answer was still no. But what about those who were in the camp? The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says that some survivors recalled hearing nearby bombs and remembered the hope it gave them, saying, "We were no longer afraid of death. At any rate, not of that death. Every bomb that exploded filled us with joy." Like most wars, World War II is often taught in terms of strategies, tactics, and logistics. But just as often, complete coincidences change the fate of a battle and world history. After the deadly December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, American authorities searched for any clues to the raid that they might have missed, and they seemingly found some in the most unlikely of places: the New Yorker magazine's advertisements. In the November 22, 1941 issue, there were multiple things that in retrospect seemed weirdly out of place, starting with the cover, which showed a trick-or-treater wearing a Hitler mask. Inside, an ad for a dice game called Deadly Double showed people playing the game in an air raid shelter, even though America wasn't even at war. And a smaller ad for the same game showed dice with the numbers 12 and 7, even though neither of those numbers appear on a standard 6-sided die, along with the word warning and a double cross symbol. Investigators reportedly looked into the ad to see if it was some kind of coded message regarding the bombing, but nothing came of it. In fact, the game's creator, Roger Paul Craig, openly mocked the notion and even later joined the Office of Strategic Services, the forebearer of the CIA. And it wasn't even the only eerie coincidence on the magazine rack that accidentally predicted the attack. The December 1941 issue of National Comics featured an Uncle Sam cover story called The Bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now that's spooky. If you were a high-ranking Allied military officer who cracked open the Daily Telegraph in spring 1944, you had cause to be concerned. Starting that May, certain answers to the crossword aligned with code names for the upcoming D-Day invasion. Was this a plot that would somehow tip off the Germans? Could the utterly massive military operation be doomed by a crossword? For MI5 agents, the accumulation of hints was hard to ignore. Over the course of multiple issues, the answers to the Daily Telegraph crossword included code names like Utah and Omaha for proposed landing sites, Mulberry, a mobile harbor, Neptune, the seaborne part of the operation, and even Overlord, the code name for the whole operation. Agents finally tracked down crossword setter Leonard Daw, but instead of being a devious Nazi agent, Daw was actually a quite surprised teacher. It was eventually decided that the likely cause of the coincidence was that Daw had unwittingly picked up the words from his students, who in turn heard them from loose-lipped Allied service members stationed nearby. Either way, the crossword puzzle coincidence didn't impact D-Day, and the invasion of mainland Europe proved to be a major success. The Battle of Midway was one of the most important and decisive moments of the entire war. In early June 1942, the confrontation between American and Japanese air and naval forces north of Midway Atoll in the Pacific Ocean was the turning point in the Allies' favor. The Americans lost 1 aircraft carrier, but the Japanese lost 4, as well as more support ships, more planes, and 10 times as many men. Some of that was due in part to superior intelligence, but amazingly, a large part of the success came down to good luck and pure coincidence. The US carriers launched their planes in waves, leading to uncoordinated attacks. Things seemed to get worse when one group got lost and couldn't find the Japanese fleet. But then everything came together, literally. By the time the lost planes found the fleet, they had been delayed long enough to coincidentally show up at the exact same time as 2 other attack groups. As the Japanese fleet maneuvered and shifted positions, the massed American planes also happened to come in at the precise altitude and angle that was perfect for an attack.
Enterprise's dive-bombing squadron plays a hunch and changes course. And in their sights appear the 4 Japanese carriers.
And as an added stroke of luck, the Japanese planes that were supposed to provide defensive cover for the fleets were all drawn away at that exact moment by a 4th American squadron that happened to appear just minutes earlier. It all added up to a crushing victory that turned the tide and effectively gave America control of the Pacific for the rest of the war. Tsutomu Yamaguchi endured one of the most terrible coincidences of the war when he survived the atomic bombings of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, Yamaguchi was completing a long business trip to Hiroshima when he witnessed the Enola Gay in the skies above Hiroshima. He later said he even saw a small object drop from the plane. Moments later, the bomb detonated. Yamaguchi took cover in a nearby ditch before a shock wave picked him up and deposited him in a patch of potato plants. Badly burned, Yamaguchi made his way through the devastation to the train station, where he boarded a train for his hometown of Nagasaki. Unbelievably, a fevered, bandaged Yamaguchi went into his Nagasaki office for work the morning of August 9th. According to his account, Yamaguchi was trying to explain what happened in Hiroshima to his disbelieving supervisor when an atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Miraculously, this time he was unhurt by the blast, and his wife and child survived as well. Yamaguchi was one of roughly 165 people who survived both atomic bombs, but is the only double survivor officially recognized by the Japanese government. He died of cancer in 2010 at the age of 93.
I have walked and crawled through the bottom of hell. I should be dead, but it was my fate to keep on living.
Jumping out of an airplane is scary even when you aren't being shot at, but for one paratrooper on D-Day, an amazing coincidence calmed his nerves when he discovered his own mother had personally inspected his parachute to make sure it was safe. Sounds impossible? It probably should have been, but on the night of June 5, 1944, Private Robert C. Hillman told a war correspondent on his plane, "I know my chute's okay because my mother checked it. She works in the Pioneer Parachute Company in our town, and her job is giving the final once-over to all chutes they manufacture." And he was right. According to that reporter, Hillman's parachute was actually marked with his mother's initials. It must have helped. Hillman not only survived jumping on D-Day, he made it home from the war and lived a long life before passing away in 1993. In a truly strange coincidence, 3 major figures from World War II all spent time working as chicken farmers. Juan Pujol Garcia was a graduate of Spain's highly regarded Royal Poultry School who decided to fight Nazis in a truly unique way. He created a fake identity and convinced the Germans that he was a spy. Then, once he had created a whole fake spy network to trick the Germans, Britain brought him on board as an actual spy. Garcia ultimately played a key role in spreading disinformation that prevented the Germans from learning about the plans for D-Day.
It was very lucky for the Allies that Juan Pujol appeared when he did. He was the right fantasist at the right time.
Maybe they should have known better, considering that SS leader Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi second-in-command, had once been a failed chicken farmer himself. Himmler was captured by the Allies in 1945 and chewed on a cyanide pill rather than face justice. Another Nazi official, Adolph Eichmann, was also briefly captured by Allied troops. But before he could be prosecuted for helping orchestrate the Holocaust, Eichmann escaped. He then hid out in Germany in plain sight under his assumed identity of, you guessed it, a chicken farmer. He even gloated about selling eggs to British soldiers, writing, "No one was suspicious of the quiet little egg farmer." Eichmann's eggy facade finally cracked in 1960, though, when he was captured by Israeli agents in Argentina. He was put on trial, sentenced to death, and then hanged in 1962. What does a 14th century Central Asian warlord have to do with World War II? If you ask some people, everything. Timur was an undefeated military conqueror whose empire stretched the breadth of Asia. When he died in 1405, he was buried in what is now Uzbekistan in a stunningly grand tomb. Fast forward to 1941, Mikhail Gerasimov was a Soviet archaeologist who specialized in reconstructing the faces of historic figures. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin sent Gerasimov and a team of archaeologists to Uzbekistan with orders to open Timur's tomb. Here's where facts become legends. According to stories, when the Soviets arrived, 3 mysterious old men stopped them at the entrance to the tomb with a warning that a curse had been placed on Timur's resting place. The Soviets reportedly proceeded anyway, ignoring warnings supposedly carved both inside and outside the tomb. And around June 20th, 1941, Timur's grave was opened and his remains were taken away. Just 2 days later, Germany declared war on the Soviet Union and launched an invasion. Some superstitious folk claim this is proof of the curse, and these tinfoil hat theories don't end there. In November 1942, Timur was finally reburied in his tomb. 5 weeks later, the Soviets defeated Germany at the Battle of Stalingrad, turning the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. That tenuous coincidence is enough for some people to believe that by reburying Timur, the curse had been lifted, despite there being almost no real proof of any of it.
But this place is haunted by a curse that changed the mind of Stalin.
For Germans, November 9th is known as the Day of Destiny due to a number of historical events leading up to World War II that coincidentally happened on that date. It started with the closing days of World War I, as the German Empire crumbled on November 9, 1918, leading to the end of the war 2 days later. Then, with economic and civil strife racking the new German Republic, Adolf Hitler chose November 9, 1923 to lead the small Nazi party in a revolt known as the Bierhallputsch. The Nazis were stopped and Hitler was thrown in jail for 9 months, which pushed him to seek power through quasi-legitimate means instead of open rebellion. Finally, as Chancellor of Germany, Hitler oversaw a wave of anti-Semitic laws that made life all the more difficult for Jewish people in Germany and beyond. This reign of terror escalated dramatically on November 9, 1938, in a wave of state-sponsored violence known as Kristallnacht. Organized mobs of Nazis and Nazi sympathizers destroyed synagogues, Jewish homes, and Jewish-owned businesses. Modern historians estimate between 1,000 and 2,000 Jewish people were killed, and some 30,000 Jewish men were also arrested and forced into concentration camps. Did you ever wonder why the fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't a bigger deal in Germany? Well, it turns out that the wall came down on November 9, 1989. Nobody there wants any celebrations to get twisted. Probably a good call. When Japan struck the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor, Honolulu in December 1941, it was in possession of one of the largest navies in the world. By the end of the war, most of that navy had been destroyed, including 2 sister ships tied together by name, design, and coincidence: Shokaku and Zuikaku. Their names translate roughly to flying crane and lucky crane, and the lucky part would prove true, because whenever the ships faced battle together, the Zuikaku fared much better. When the Shokaku was damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, it went into port for repairs, while the Zuikaku waited for its twin ship to come back into active duty. This meant that both ships missed the decisive Battle of Midway. The Shokaku was again damaged in November of that year and went back for repairs, while the Zuikaku remained relatively unscathed. The Shokaku finally sank in June 1944 in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Zuikaku, in contrast, sustained serious damage but still came out of the engagement intact. The Zuikaku's own demise came in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. It was hit by the USS Lexington CB-16, coincidentally the successor to a previous carrier of the same name that had been sunk by aircraft launched from the Zuikaku and Shokaku. Finally, there was at least one happy coincidence during the war. As young men, Lee Tolper and Ben Trujillo both joined the US Army and served in the European theater of World War II. The two happened to meet one day when Trujillo noticed Tolper, a radio operator, working by a large antenna. The two had a short conversation before going their separate ways. That should have been it, but fate had a different plan. After the war, both men ended up moving to Denver, and both eventually began working at jewelry stores. One day, Trujillo's boss sent him to buy some parts, and the man behind the counter was none other than Tolper. Recalling their brief meeting on the other side of the world, the two began talking and soon started a friendship that would last more than 70 years until Trujillo's death in 2022 at the age of 96. It's hard to understate the sheer scale of World War II, so maybe it'll come as no surprise to find that beneath all the heroics and atrocities, there are still a few mysteries that haven't been solved, even to this day. Here are some of the strangest of all. For the people of Los Angeles, February 25, 1942 is one of the tensest days of the entire war. On this day, in the early morning hours, military personnel and civilians alike were alerted to an incoming bombing raid over the city. Searchlights swept across the night sky while people sat in their blacked-out homes, quietly wondering if Japanese forces had been emboldened by their attack on Pearl Harbor months earlier. Their fears seemed to be confirmed when anti-aircraft guns began going off around 3 a.m., first in Santa Monica and then across the rest of the region. Troops were even ordered to open fire where some had seen an object floating through the sky. But when the smoke cleared, there was no sign of any attempted Japanese attack. 5 people died as a result of the so-called Battle of Los Angeles, 3 from a car accident and 2 from heart attacks, while a few buildings were damaged by anti-aircraft shells that hadn't detonated in the air. So what happened? Well, the Secretary of the Navy basically chalked it up to nerves, calling the whole thing a false alarm based on faulty radar readings. Some witnesses swore they saw enemy airplanes soaring through the sky, however, while others suggested a weather balloon might have been to blame. A small number of people even claimed that it was all down to flying saucers. Sadly, nobody has ever produced any strong evidence one way or another. World War II aircraft crews had plenty to worry about, to say the least. Flying comes with its own difficulties even in peacetime, such as navigation and the need to refuel. But when you're flying in a war zone, you also need to deal with, enemies. But by far the strangest hazard of all for World War II era aircraft were Foo Fighters. And no, we don't mean these guys. Foo Fighters were first reported by the Associated Press in 1945, though Allied flight crews had been seeing them at least a year before that. These crews often reported seeing balls of light that behaved strangely, typically following other planes and then peeling off or simply disappearing after a matter of minutes. Some of them even flashed and flew in formation, leading some airmen to believe that they were enemy weapons. But there are no reports that Foo Fighters ever attacked or otherwise harmed any aircraft or its occupants. They didn't even register on radar. So if these weird lights weren't German weapons, then what were they? Many have blamed combat fatigue that plagued hard-working crews, though many of the airmen themselves rankled at the idea that they had basically been hallucinating. One common suggestion, the visible electrical discharge known as St. Elmo's fire, doesn't really explain the strange movements of these lights either. Despite a CIA investigation in 1953, no one has ever been able to come up with a satisfactory answer for them. In 1941, a Scottish farmer found a burning plane in his field and a strange man standing beside it. The man claimed to be someone named Captain David Horn, but it soon became clear that was a blatant lie. In fact, Horn was a real Nazi politician named Rudolf Hess, who had flown from Germany to Scotland, evading anti-aircraft artillery and radar detection along the way until finally crash landing in that field. But why would such a high-ranking member of the Nazi regime leave his position and literally throw himself into the heart of enemy territory? Hess claimed he wanted to broker peace between the Nazis and sympathetic British officials, but many remained skeptical of this claim. Some simply believed that Hess was mentally ill. His genuine shock that he was treated as a prisoner and not a diplomat after being arrested certainly didn't help his case in that regard. After his arrest and subsequent imprisonment, Hess apparently realized that he was in very dire straits indeed. He attempted suicide on multiple occasions during the course of the war, but survived to be jailed in the Allied-controlled Spandau prison. Finally, in 1987, the 93-year-old Hess was found dead in prison.
One of Adolf Hitler's most fanatical followers, his deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, died today at the age of 93.
His death was ruled as a suicide, although his son has repeatedly insisted, albeit with no supporting evidence, that he was actually murdered by British intelligence. Nearly a year to the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Navy radar spotted a single aircraft approaching the area on course from Japan. They quickly scrambled 2 planes to intercept the newcomer, and the pilots reported spotting an American P-40 fighter that had been riddled with bullet holes. The pilot inside apparently waved at them, but appeared to be covered in blood. The plane crashed on land soon after, but inspection of the wreckage showed no evidence that there had ever been a pilot in the first place. So where did the plane come from? Who was its pilot? And most importantly, can the story even be believed? Well, the bad news is that this tale is almost certainly made up. It shares a close resemblance to a story written by Robert Lee Scott Jr., a writer who also served as a pilot during World War II. Scott later said that he and a fellow pilot had come up with the story to stay entertained during the long days of the war, but would never have said anything if they knew it was going to grow into an urban legend. Raoul Wallenberg is rightfully considered a hero of World War II. He was a Swedish diplomat who, through his position as deputy secretary at the Swedish embassy in Budapest, helped thousands of Jewish people flee the Nazis via Hungary. In early 1945, however, he was apprehended by Soviet officers, and despite not being accused of any particular crime, quickly disappeared into the Soviet prison system. Some wonder if the Soviets had suspected him of spying for the Americans. Others think that the Soviet Union wanted to hit Sweden hard for its pro-Nazi policies earlier in the war. Either way, Wallenberg's eventual fate has never been fully known. The Swedish government didn't do much to follow his case, as they were reluctant to become embroiled in Cold War politics. The Soviets later claimed that Wallenberg had died of a heart attack in Lubyanka on July 17, 1947. But some people swore that they had crossed paths with Wallenberg as late as the 1980s. Researchers claim that there are still more records of Wallenberg's movements somewhere out there, but until the Russian government releases them, the true fate of this heroic diplomat will remain a mystery. Named for the German word for treasure hunter, Schatzgräber was a station established by the Nazis just 620 miles from the North Pole. It was strategically situated to interfere with Allied transports moving troops and supplies through the Arctic, and also provided valuable weather information to the Germans. But Schatzgräber was abandoned in 1944 when staff grew sick after eating raw polar bear meat. Hey, it happens. But why not bring in a new crew to man the station, considering how important it was to the Nazis? And why didn't anybody reveal the station's existence until well after the war in 1953? While other explanations for Schatzgräber's existence include the idea that the Nazis were conducting archaeological excavations for mysterious Nordic artifacts. Considering many Nazis were fascinated by the occult and practically revered the mystical Nordic past that they believed legitimized their regime, it's entirely possible that Schatzgräber may have been connected to this bizarre Nazi obsession. The Amber Room was located inside the Catherine Palace, a royal palace in Pushkin, Russia. Previously, it had been in St. Petersburg's Winter Palace, and before that, Prussia's Charlottenburg Palace. It was given as a gift by Prussian King Frederick William I to Peter the Great in 1716, after the Russian royal visited Frederick William's place and took a particular liking to the room. This place was seriously fancy, too. The Amber Room was constructed out of multiple tons of amber panels, each backed with gold. Later renovations added even more glitz and glamour to the room, to the point where many dubbed it the eighth wonder of the world. When invading Nazi soldiers entered the Amber Room in 1941, the panels were nowhere to be found. Or at least that's what it seemed like. In fact, fleeing officials had plastered the panels with wallpaper, hoping to mask them from the invaders, but the ruse was quickly uncovered by the Germans. Just a few days later, they had shipped the amber panels to Königsberg, Germany. And that's where the disassembled Amber Room was last spotted. After that, the trail goes cold, and nobody's really sure what happened to it. Some suspect that it's now at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, after a steamer was sunk near there in 1945. Others think that the panels were destroyed in air raids, or maybe still hidden somewhere in storage.
We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top men.
There's no shortage of legends about lost Nazi treasure out there, but some of the other Axis powers figure into these mysteries too. Take Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, for example. Yamashita reportedly buried looted treasure somewhere in the Philippines while Japanese forces were occupying the nation. When he was executed by American forces in 1946, however, any hope of finding the treasure was dashed. Of course, that's assuming that it's even real. Many people have searched for Yamashita's gold in the intervening decades, despite the total lack of evidence or records supporting the tale, and have invariably come up with nothing. That hasn't deterred anyone, though. The fabled treasure hoard was even at the center of a 1988 court case brought against former Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos by a soldier named Rogelio Rojas. Rojas claimed that he had found part of that hoard, but that Marcos had promptly swooped in and seized it. A court later found in his favor and awarded Rojas his own hoard of cash in 1996. Unfortunately, by that point, Rojas had been dead for 3 years. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, though some people insist he was killed for his role in the supposed discovery of Yamashita's gold. The region of Lower Silesia in modern-day Poland was once considered to be a part of Germany. War being what it is, borders have since shifted, and the German occupants of the region fled over the course of World War II. The Polish people who took their place have since uncovered treasures left behind by their German predecessors, and as the legend goes, there may be more valuable loot still left uncovered. One of the most colorful stories claims that there is an entire underground train full of plundered Nazi treasure buried in a collapsed tunnel somewhere in Poland. It's certainly true that the Nazis built underground tunnels, and they did indeed steal cultural treasures and valuables from occupied territories. This has apparently been more than enough evidence for some treasure hunters, including one or two who insist they stumbled upon it in the past. Still, nobody has ever managed to provide the location of the Nazi gold train, or prove that it even exists at all. Towards the end of the war and in its aftermath, a number of Nazis and other fascists left Europe to escape the consequences of their defeat. Some high-placed intellectuals, like Nazi rocket scientist Werner von Braun, were quietly rescued via Operation Paperclip, which relocated some 1,600 German scientists and their family members to America. Other Nazis disappeared from Europe at the end of the war too, with many only reappearing decades later. For example, Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina by the Mossad in 1960, while Auschwitz's so-called Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele, lived out a quiet life in Brazil until 1979. So how could these criminals have gotten so far and evaded capture for so long, with some escaping punishment entirely? Well, the escape networks used by the Nazis were eventually known as rat lines, though it's still not clear who was involved, how the rat lines ran, and how much everyone knew about the whole affair. What is clear is that many South American countries seem to be full of government officials who were more than happy to ignore the Nazis fleeing to their shores, and evidence seems to suggest that Vatican officials also played a significant role in aiding Nazi war criminals as they fled Europe. Some have even claimed that Pope Pius XII knew more than he was letting on, though the exact nature of his involvement in the rat lines is still a mystery to this day. So here's the thing about war. No country enters one without the desire to dominate the other side and win. But in order to do so, there are often some pretty strict rules that the soldiers fighting in the trenches have to follow. But did you know that during World War II, one country outlawed dancing? Yeah, me neither. Stick around to find out who it was, because today we're looking at some of the strangest rules soldiers during World War II had to follow. "We shall never surrender." That's one of Winston Churchill's most famous quotes, and one of my worst impressions. But yeah, he's got nothing on the Japanese. You see, imperial leaders took it a step further and added in a fight to the death or keep fighting. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. Some of these Japanese servicemen refused to surrender for years or even decades after the empire's surrender. Among the most notable of the holdouts to return to Japan was Shoichi Yokoi. He was the last of nearly 5,000 Japanese fighters who had refused to surrender after Guam fell to the US forces. Yokoi hid out until 1972 when he was found by local fishermen. He apologized publicly to the emperor upon his return. 2 years later, Hiro Onoda was discovered on Lubang, refusing to be repatriated until his commanding officer arrived and directly ordered him to do so.
As an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I had to follow my orders, as I was a soldier.
The last confirmed soldier was a Taiwanese native fighting for the Japanese. He was found in December 1974. As recently as 2005, 2 elderly men emerged in the Philippines claiming to be holdouts, though their claims have been met with tons of skepticism. So we know all about those Japanese holdouts and fight to the death, but this wasn't an issue exclusive to the imperial forces. Most leaders decreed to keep fighting, and whatever you do, don't retreat or run for it without orders. The Soviet Union took an especially dim view of desertion. During the German onslaught, Stalin issued his anti-desertion Order 270, which stated that even when surrounded, Soviet units were to fight to the death rather than surrender, or be shot if they didn't resist hard enough. Even their families back home could be subject to punishment. Though some Soviet deserters were shot, it was deemed counterproductive to shoot too many. The most common fate was to be sent back to the front, either in one's own unit or a special penal unit assigned dangerous work. And if you think that the good old US of A was above that kind of order, well, that's a no. The US executed one soldier for desertion during the war. His name was Private Eddie Slovik. Slovik deserted in the autumn of 1944. He returned and was warned not to disappear again, but then he deserted a second time. General Eisenhower wanted to make an example out of him, and he was executed by firing squad in January 1945. He remains the only US serviceman to be executed for desertion since 1864. The Winter War is this kind of forgotten part of World War II. That's when the Soviets invaded Finland. Now, the Finns fought like the Dickens and gave Russia all they had. Given all this stress, it's easy to imagine a Finnish fighter wanting to spend his time on leave unwinding. But one thing was forbidden: dancing. Yes, public dances for both civilians and for soldiers on leave were banned in Finland, twice. First during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and then during the Continuation War of 1941 to 1944. People flouted the ban as time wore on. After all, nearly 5 years without busting a move was a lot to ask. But dancers were raided, and a number of people were punished, who were even killed in these dance hall raids. After the Continuation War with the Soviets concluded in 1944, Finns had to put up with shortages, the loss of one of their provinces, and retreating Germans. But at least they could again distract themselves with dancing. You probably know that General George Patton was one of the United States' most effective commanders of World War II. But what you may not know was that he was a snappy dresser. This urge to dress well influenced his standards for troops under his command, who had to wear neckties in battle, even in hot, sticky Sicily. Reportedly, the only way out of the necktie decree was to present a doctor's note, as one soldier who had survived having his throat cut by a German soldier did. And the options? I'd probably just suck it up and wear the necktie. As Allied soldiers approached the university city of Bonn in Western Germany, the Germans tried to destroy records implicating them in their nation's crimes. But a quick-thinking Polish lab technician salvaged the dossier of German and Austrian scientists. This information was used to make a list for one of the most grim scavenger hunts in modern history. America wanted to benefit from these scientific minds nearly as much as they wanted to prevent the Soviets from doing so. So Operation Paperclip, a program to snag and use these experts, was born. Armed with this list, American soldiers capturing Nazi forces were on the lookout for these VIPs, with whom the US might be willing to cut a deal, offering them amnesty and a new life in the US in exchange for their scientific know-how. Individual soldiers sometimes made the collars. Werner von Braun, a brilliant rocket scientist later key to the US space program, surrendered to a private monitoring a rural road in Austria.
Now here's a model, my design for a 4-stage orbital rocket ship.
Cleanliness is next to godliness. And uncleanliness? Well, that's the Oregon Trail. Typhus, a bacterial disease spread by lice, was so feared by German administrators that enterprising Polish doctors faked an outbreak to keep workers from being deported to Germany for forced labor. Dysentery, our old friend, has plagued armies for centuries. Hand washing, general cleanliness, hot showers, and aggressive laundering went a long way toward limiting the spread of conditions like these. In addition to straightforward personal hygiene, maintaining a sanitary environment was also emphasized in wartime messaging. Cleaning latrines, covering trash, and managing insect populations were simple actions enlisted soldiers could take that limited the spread of disease and kept more men in fighting shape.
Dirt and filth are the brothers of discomfort, disease, and death.
So, obviously, secrecy is key during wartime, and both the Axis and Allied armies worked hard to conceal their plans, which included making sure soldiers kept their mouths shut. Starting in March 1940, Nazi censors began monitoring mail going to, from, and between German soldiers. Among various other restrictions, soldiers were to write only in European languages, which explicitly excluded Morse code, refrain from giving details of Axis or Allied movements or attacks, and send no pictures of important military installations. The Allies also censored mail, and with similar aims in mind. And self-censorship was also an important factor. Public information campaigns taught both soldiers and people on the home front of the dangers of loose lips. Both Axis and Allied forces used scorched earth approaches during the war, with one of the most striking examples coming in the early stages of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Soviet units smashed roads and bridges, disabled the railroad, destroyed food stores, and in some cases broke down entire factories and sent them further east for reassembly. The Soviets also evacuated more than 17 million of their citizens from the combat zone, denying the Germans this colossal pool of labor, preserving it for their own war effort. Nazis notoriously left ruins behind when they retreated, but thankfully, one of the worst proposed scorched earth attacks never came to pass. Faced with the imminent liberation of Paris, Hitler ordered the French capital destroyed. A horrified General Dietrich von Koltitz refused to follow orders, instead stalling until the Allies retook the City of Lights. After the war ended, the victorious Allies were left to handle those who had carried out the Axis powers' crimes against humanity. Key Nazis were taken to Nuremberg to face trial. There, a number of defendants presented the defense that they had just been following orders, and thus could not be personally held responsible for what happened. And conveniently for them, the ultimate source of those orders, Adolf Hitler, was dead. The judges, drawn from the victorious major Allied states of France, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, rejected this defense. They wrote in a decision that created an important legal precedent that the soldiers who had committed atrocities knew, or at least should have known, that what they were doing was wrong. While it might have been dangerous for them to disobey these orders, they were not at immediate risk of death for doing so. Nuremberg established the right of the world to hold such wrongdoers accountable.
Humanity has waited for this moment of retribution, when the insane ambitions of men like these would come up against the stone wall of world justice.
Here's the interesting thing. It actually sort of circles back to the first thing we discussed. Japanese soldiers that kept on fighting. In a sense, legally speaking, soldiers should know when to stop and when to surrender, regardless of orders from superiors. Now, we tend to gloss over Italy when it comes to World War II, but they were fascist way before Germany ever was. Of course, Italy's gung-ho approach to an all-fascist Europe cracked in 1943. Several factors, perhaps most importantly the Allied invasion of Italy in September of that year, effectively obliterated the Italian will to continue the war. In late July, the seldom relevant King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed Mussolini. The caretaker government took control. Sort of. They were too inept to even give the military orders to defend Rome, and Germany soon overran northern and central Italy. Allied commanders correctly assumed that Italy's wartime struggles would turn most Italians, including those in the armed forces, against Germany. In October 1943, barely a month after the Allied invasion, Italy officially switched sides and joined the Allies. In under a year, Italian soldiers had gone from Germany's staunchest ally to their sworn enemy. It also marked the second straight World War where Italy switched sides. Got that going. France and Poland, Germany's largest and strongest neighbors, both came under foreign occupation relatively early in the war. But while both nations were defeated, their battered armies weren't completely destroyed, and those that survived continued to fight for the rest of the war. Using bases in the United Kingdom and personnel and resources from across France's colonial empire in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, the French general Charles de Gaulle cobbled together an effective fighting force. These Free French fighters coordinated with their allies in the resistance and occupied France, while also fighting alongside British troops in Africa and Italy, eventually participating in the liberation of France itself. Poland had a much wilder ride. They were initially invaded by both Germany and the Soviet Union, prior to the Soviets switching sides and joining the Allied cause. While some Polish soldiers evacuated to France and the United Kingdom and participated in the war efforts there, others were captured by the Soviet Union. So when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets recruited a captured Polish general to lead an army of Polish prisoners against the Germans. These freed soldiers trained in Iran of all places, where they joined up with British forces who were occupying parts of Iran to keep its oil out of Axis hands. And we're not talking about a few troops here and there. Somewhere around 33,000 Polish soldiers ended up in Iran. You didn't have that on your bingo card. Mechanical malfunction, a wayward torpedo, and getting run down by a cargo ship? Not all subs made it out of World War II intact, and some suffered truly bizarre fates. The book U.S. Submarines 1941 to 1943 by Jim Chrisley states that the USS Caitlin and its crew of 78 men were lost at sea on December 1, 1943, but the truth is considerably more complicated. In fact, the story of this particular submarine shows just how mysterious the fates of these vessels could be during wartime, even when people were roughly aware of the area the sub was supposed to patrol. The details of the Caitlin's final days are murky, to say the least. Per the Navy Department Library, the submarine arrived in Darwin, Australia on November 16th after its very first patrol mission, during which it sank 2 Japanese merchant freighters. It departed for its second patrol on November 17th after some repairs. This was the last conclusive sighting of the boat, and the only somewhat confirmed information of its disappearance is that it happened somewhere in the western Pacific Ocean around the Celebes or Molucca Sea. Around the time of the Caitlin's disappearance, there were unverified and inconclusive reports of an unrecognized American submarine under attack by Japanese forces, and another submarine reported a potential sighting on December 2nd. Still, as Michael Sturma's book, The USS Flyer, Death and Survival on a World War II Submarine notes, the common belief appears to be that the sub succumbed to naval mines that were abundant in the area. Some disappearances have little to no drama that can be perceived by an outside observer, but that doesn't mean that they don't have mysteries to spare. Take the USS Amberjack, a US Navy submarine that served on the Pacific Front during World War II. Using Brisbane, Australia as its port, the Amberjack achieved some notable victories during its third and final patrol, which started on January 26, 1943. It sank at least 2 ships, one of which was carrying explosives. It also reported an encounter with enemy ships and destroyers, and even managed to take a prisoner. However, that's all we know for sure. All the Navy can be certain about is that the Amberjack disappeared, taking all but one of its crew of over 70 men with it. Interestingly, the one man who we know didn't disappear lives on in Navy tradition. Before the submarine was lost, its chief pharmacist mate Arthur C. Beeman was confirmed to have died during a mission on February 4th, and a recreation center at Pearl Harbor submarine base bears his name. There is a possibility that the submarine was destroyed during a depth charge attack by enemy vessels on February 16th. There's little concrete evidence about this. The attack may also have been on another submarine called the Grampus, or both of them, or perhaps something completely different happened to the Amberjack. Of course, not every submarine that became lost during World War II was an American one. According to Cristiano Diadamo of the Regia Marina Italiana website, one of the Royal Italian Navy's more infamous submarines was the Marcello-class vessel Barbarigo. It is known for its numerous successful missions, along with some rather inaccurate claims, courtesy of one of its commanding officers, Enzo Grossi. Per Paul Ackerman's book, Encyclopedia of British Submarines, 1901 to 1955, Grossi claimed that in May 1942, the Barbarigo had managed to sink a massive 33,000-ton California or Maryland-class battleship. In October of that year, he reported the same outcome for a smaller but still impressive Mississippi-class vessel. The second sinking was later confirmed as a massively embellished encounter with a much smaller British Flower-class corvette ship that Barbarigo didn't even manage to sink. As for the first one, the crew may have genuinely been under the impression that the attack was a success, but it later transpired that the American ship in question not only didn't sink, but hadn't even noticed the Italian submarine trying to attack it. Grossi's tenure notwithstanding, Barbarigo served well on numerous missions, but it didn't survive the war. Converted into a trade submarine, it disappeared off the coast of Bordeaux, France in June 1943. It is thought that the heavily loaded vessel sank due to enemy activity or simply broke down.
The memorial at Pearl Harbor reminds us that submariners never consider them lost.
Three fallen enemies and a main character disappearing might sound like something out of a spaghetti western, but according to the book United States Submarine Losses in World War II, this is also a pretty good description of the second and final patrol mission of the USS Keat. The submarine left its base in the western Pacific island of Guam on March 1st, 1945, and while its first mission had been entirely drama-free, this one featured plenty of action. After sending in a weather report as part of its mission on March 20th, however, the Keat and its crew of 87 men were never heard from again. The sub sank no less than 3 freighters on the night of March 10th. This and an unsuccessful encounter with a fourth enemy ship left the submarine with precious few torpedoes, and it was on its way to Pearl Harbor to deal with the situation. Obviously, it never arrived at its destination, but there's little indication of what actually happened. The Navy's best guess is that a Japanese submarine managed to sink it, but there are no records to support this theory. It's possible the sub that attacked the Keat was also destroyed before it could report this, which could have left the Keat's fate outside official record keeping. Estonia may not be known as a major player in World War II, but that doesn't mean the country didn't have submarines at play. According to the Estonian Maritime Museum, the country's 2 British-built Kalev-class submarines, Kalev and Lembeat, were completed in 1936. Lembeat is actually still around, leading a quiet existence in the aforementioned museum. Kalev, on the other hand, was not quite as lucky. According to NATO's profile of Lembeat, the creation of these subs was unconventional as the people of Estonia effectively crowdfunded the project with scrap metal donations. However, Estonia didn't have a chance to enjoy its submarines for long. After the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states in 1940, the ship served as part of the Soviet Union's Navy presence in the area, according to U-Boat.net. Unfortunately, Kalev never returned from its second World War II mission. It's believed to have run into a mine in the Gulf of Finland in either October or November 1941. Details of the incident are somewhat scarce, but since Lembeat had a crew of 32, it's probably safe to assume that number was no bigger when it disappeared. Sometimes history can't quite decide whether the fate of a missing submarine is tragic or downright embarrassing, such as the case with the German-type 7-sea submarine U-972, which the Navy Department Library lists as lost to unknown causes somewhere in the North Atlantic area in January 1944. However, the true story behind the ship's sinking might be even stranger. The books Hitler's Navy, a reference guide to the Kriegsmarine 1935 to 1945, and The Submarine Has No Friends, Friendly Fire Incidents Involving U.S. Submarines During World War II, both state that the U-boat was sunk by its own torpedo. Such an incident could have been possible with German T-5 acoustic torpedoes, which followed sound sources, but took a circular route out when they detected the first sound.
Acoustic torpedoes are designed to home in on the noise of propellers, which are located at a ship's stern.
This was an effort to circumvent the fake sound sources known as Foxers that British ships often towed behind them. However, the torpedo could have potentially picked up the sound of U-972 and targeted the U-boat itself. Per Showell, another U-boat known as U-377 also succumbed to a similar fate. Regardless, U-972's fate remains officially unknown, and while lost for unknown reasons might seem less unfortunate than sunk by its own torpedo on paper, it's of little significance to the 49 people who disappeared with the submarine. The crew and captain of the Polish submarine Orzel didn't particularly care for Nazis, and when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, they promptly relocated the vessel to Estonia. Unfortunately, it wasn't any safer there, as the local authorities were too concerned by the Nazis to let the Orzel do its thing. Instead, they captured the crew and started removing the sub's weapons and operational equipment. The Estonians thought the sub's captain, Jan Grudzinski, was fine with this, which is exactly what he wanted them to think. In reality, he and his crew were busy staging a daring escape plan that involved hostages, a harbor-wide blackout, and a desperate reverse gear escape under artillery fire. This, however, was just the beginning. They then had to make it to the UK with no navigation equipment and waters that were full of German ships that wanted a word. It took 44 days of close calls and desperation maneuvers, but they ultimately managed to get there. The Orzel's heroic escape became an international news story, but unfortunately, the good times didn't last long. In June 1940, the submarine and its crew of 54 were reported to have disappeared during a patrol mission in the North Sea. The number 13 isn't exactly known to be lucky in most walks of life. In 1940, the Dutch submarine O-13 tragically demonstrated that naval warfare may not be exempt from this particular superstition. Following reports of increased German activity in the area between Norway and Denmark, O-13 left its base in Dundee, Scotland on June 12 for a patrol mission. Sadly, the submarine and its crew of 34 men never returned. Despite attempts to locate the vessel, it remains the only missing World War II-era Dutch submarine. There are many theories as to what happened. The most prevalent explanation is that it was blown up by a sea mine. Other theories include an encounter with an enemy it was patrolling and an accidental collision with a friendly submarine. Regardless of the reason, it happened mere months after escaping Germany's invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940. Though the submarine's time with the Royal Navy was cut extremely short, it played a supporting role in one of the biggest moments of the war, protecting the ships that carried out the Dunkirk evacuation. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, the first submarine bearing the Swordfish title started its active war patrols immediately after the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. Incidentally, the Swordfish itself had been stationed in the ill-fated naval base, but it was in another location during the attack.
It was less than 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and the blow that struck us there was only the first of many attacks falling upon our allies and ourselves.
For the following 4 years, the Swordfish ran a total of 13 missions, performing important operations like high-profile evacuations, along with damaging and sinking enemy ships. That 13th mission, however, is where the Swordfish ran out of luck. On December 22, 1944, the submarine left Pearl Harbor to patrol the Nansei Shoto island chain. Radio contact was lost after January 2, 1945, and its fate remains unknown. Per the Naval History and Heritage Command, the USS Trout was a highly decorated submarine that performed several massively successful and destructive patrols of the Pacific following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The submarine took on numerous ships and sank many of them. However, the Trout had several close calls. It had to dodge torpedoes and withstand horrifying depth charge bombings that sometimes shook the vessel so violently crew members were thrown around inside. The 84-strong crew of the Trouts also found that torpedoes aren't always the most reliable weapon out there. Many of its torpedoes missed, and on more than one occasion, even direct hits wound up being duds. The Trout's 11th mission started on February 8, 1944, and proved to be its final one. The submarine was last seen refueling on February 16th and is thought to have disappeared somewhere in the vicinity of the East China Sea. The Navy suspects the Trout went down fighting since it was in an area where a submarine attacked a Japanese ship convoy on February 29th. But exactly what happened to the submarine in question, and whether it was the Trout in the first place, remains a matter of speculation.
I regret to say that the USS Trout was lost later in the war.
On the surface, the story of USS Grayling isn't too different from the many other tales of missing submarines. However, while the sub's loss remains a mystery, the Naval Department Library refers to Japanese reports that surfaced after World War II was over. These reports suggest that the Grayling might have suffered a truly peculiar fate. One of the subs actively operating in the Pacific after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Grayling started its patrols in January 1942. It sank 16 ships over the course of 8 missions before its disappearance sometime in late August or September 1943. This disappearance has been attributed to potential malfunctions or enemy attacks, but the aforementioned Japanese files have suggested something very different, that the Grayling was run over by a ship. Though the Navy's last communication with the Grayling happened on August 19th, the Japanese reports describe submarine activity in the Tablas Strait area, where it very well could have operated at the time. These sightings range from August 29th to September 9th, which according to the United States Navy Memorial is when a ship called Hokuan Maru came in. The Japanese ship spotted a barely submerged vessel in the shallow waters and promptly ran it over, reporting a clear impact. It's entirely possible that this marked the end of the Grayling and its crew of 53 men.